Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to In the Company of Charity podcast of the Daughters of Charity. And this is Sister Liz. I'm here with Sister Elizabeth, as always, my favorite sister friend co-host of the podcast. Hello, dear sister.
Hello, dear sister. How are you?
I'm good. South Texas, we're already hitting 90s. That's our
I
weather
know.
report for the day.
Yeah, we're kind of back and forth here in St. Louis. Like this morning was 38, but it's going up to like 70 something. But it was like 80 the other day, and I thought it's over. It's over. All my beautiful colder weather.
It's done.
So it's just done. It's done.
Yes.
So I'm totally ready to, be missioned to Alaska anytime.
Pack up your winter coat. You won't
Yeah.
see it again till
You know,
October.
yeah, I mean, I really got spoiled by going back to Utica. I was happily living in the South, just suffering and not realizing, how much I missed it. And then Utica just, my whole being back into alignment in the cold, dreary weather. But such as it is, I go where I'm
We are
sent.
sent. God sends us to wherever
That's
we're going
right.
to go.
That's
God
right.
and the community.
And what's really interesting, I mean, if you have gone back, and I know your dad's a meteorologist, he might be able to
Yes.
help us understand this. St. Louis, sitting kind of in the middle of the country, literally is like every storm goes around us. It either
Hmm.
goes to the north of us, it becomes snow, or to the south of us becomes flooding. And we just sit here in like calm weather. Even
There
the
you go.
tornado weather, we have our little thing goes off and it beeps loudly and tells us there's, something. And we look out at the clouds and they look like tornado clouds. Thank God we don't have anything, because tornadoes and hurricanes are horrible, you know. Um,
Yes.
but we somehow escape all the weather, all of it. I'm not really sure how that
Well, now
happens,
you
but
probably jinxed it. So get ready for some
I know
crazy thing to
some
happen.
crazy
Good
thing,
job.
yeah. And I totally don't want tornadoes, and we're not going to get a hurricane out here for sure, but or flooding or anything like that. Yeah, because the weather here is not happy weather. It's not snowstorms, which are just beautiful.
Oh, stop.
I, I know, I know.
She gets the four
So
seasons and
I,
complains.
yeah, I know. But I
We have
just,
one season.
yes, that is true. And everything just
Just
goes from green to brown and green to brown. So
basically.
I get it. Anyways, that's my thing. I'm gonna say it till probably the day I die, Cold weather is my thing. Yeah.
So we have a great episode for you guys today. This is round two of stories from Carville, and this one includes the two archivists associated, one from Carville and the other from the Daughters of Charity, the province of St. Louis. So it's a pretty cool. What I love is the part, of course, when y'all talk about the sisters, and we don't like get a choice per se. You can't just say no to being missioned somewhere. Um, but in this case, they gave the sisters a choice. Are you willing to go to Carville and work with the folks who have Hansen's disease? And do you want to give them the spoiler alert?
Yeah. 100 sisters offered to go. They really thought maybe 10 would go, because leprosy, as it was known at that time, was very, very scary. I mean, there's biblical dimensions to this, and nobody understood. And it was the 1800s, it's the late 1800s. And they thought, well, we'll ask, you know, the sisters, they could choose. It was like the one mission they could choose to go.
Mm,
They said to volunteer. 100 people, 100 sisters, 100 daughters of charity from across the country said, I'll go. Oh, just makes you proud,
that's
Like,
cool.
yeah. And
That is
we'll
cool.
hear in another episode from Sister Loretta Gettemeyer, who was living in Donaldsonville, which was just down the river from Carville. And the sisters in Donaldsonville would take the ferry up to Carville to celebrate the holidays, because those sisters were a little isolated, because of
Mm.
the work they were doing. And so they would come up and they would celebrate holidays, and they would, go to the Christmas cantata and all these kind of different things. And so it's been a work of ours since those sisters arrived in the 1800s. And yeah, it's quite beautiful, really, when you think about the number of sisters who have been. I think it's something like over 132 sisters in the history, our history at Carville.
That's
In and out
cool.
of the stores. Yeah. Yeah.
If you haven't gotten the King of the Armadillos book yet or have access to it, go for it. But the other piece we heard from Pam herself, Pam Fessler, who did a book called Carville's Cure, which has a lot of information about what the sisters, the Daughters of Charity, had done there at Carville. So check that book out. Pam did a lot of, and you'll hear about her as well here in this episode, that she did a lot of research there in Emmitsburg at our archives.
Yeah, so we did say this was the Archivist's episode, and it is really the Archivist's episode. I felt like it sometimes they just took over, it was great.
They're
It was
great.
really great. But yeah, so Pam had done a lot of research and had connected with Emmitsburg, and Elizabeth Schexnyder, who's the archivist in Carville, is connecting now more with Scott Keefer in Emmitsburg. I feel like, and Wendy and I have talked about this in the different connections we've had, that her writing of this book has kind of reopened a way to talk about Carville that's a little different than just the history. I mean, the history is important and the sisters, but it was all very kind of technical. This has kind of given it a kind of mythic feel to it, a storytelling feel. Maybe that's the way to talk about it. So there's a lot more storytelling around it, and I think you'll hear that from this episode, and somewhat in the next episode, Elizabeth Schexnyder will join us again, and we'll actually have the king of the Armadillos with us. So it's very exciting. Very,
Get
very exciting.
excited.
Yeah.
Well, this may warrant Carville having its own podcast, but that's a story for another day.
That's right. Yeah, I think they're working on it. So
thank you guys so much for listening. Enjoy the episode, and definitely share this out. If you see it on social media, reshare it from our Instagram and Facebook of the Daughters of Charity and of the Company of Charity podcast. And do send us an email. We're always taking your prayer intentions, your suggestions, any feedback y'all have. We do have people listening. We got some stats recently. I think it's something like 1,500 so far for this season. So that's pretty cool.
It is very cool. We should say that like we're surprised people are listening. But when you're doing this, it feels like we're out in the we're speaking in the wind, but we know we're not, because people have been responding and reaching out to us, and we really love that, and it means so much to us. So please do that and let us know. As we've always said, if you have ideas of who we could interview, or just to let us know how we're doing and how we're impacting your life, and know that all of that impacts ours. It really helps us a lot.
companyofcharity@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the episode.
So hi, everyone. This is Sister Elizabeth, and I'm with you again with the Company of Charity, the podcast of the Daughters of Charity. And I am here again with Wendy Chin-Tanner, the author of King of the Armadillos. If you heard our last episode, you know that Wendy is the daughter of a gentleman who was a resident, a patient at Carville Hospital, which was at that time called the Leprosarium. And we're doing a series on Carville, both through Wendy's eyes as the daughter of a survivor, someone who lived through that time, and has written this nonfiction book, again, called King of the Armadillos. The involvement of the Daughters of Charity, who were the ones who were running it at the time, even though it's a federally government-funded program. And we're here today also with two of the archivists involved in this work as well. So Elizabeth Schexnyder is the archivist for the Museum of Hansen's Disease, the National Hansen Disease Museum, which is part of Health and Human Health Resources Services administration. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yes.
So welcome, Elizabeth. And
Thank you.
I'm also here with Scott Keefer, who is the archivist for the Daughters of Charity of the province of St. Louise. And both of these archivists are really the caretakers of all of the artifacts, all of the information in relation to Carville and so many amazing people who were part of Carville. But I want to go back to Wendy. Welcome you, Wendy, back. And we just had a great conversation on the last podcast. So again, if you haven't listened to it, go back and hear that. And this is exciting for both of us, since both Scott and Elizabeth are close to us in many different ways. So I wonder if you wanted to start the first question as we welcome Elizabeth and Scott to the podcast today.
So I am thrilled to be able to have Elizabeth here with Scott to discuss the collections that they both take care of. I see them as incredibly important figures in preserving this history that would be otherwise forgotten. So Elizabeth, do you want to start us off with telling us how you came to be involved in the museum, what the museum is all about, what you have, and what you hope the museum will bring to its visitors?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for welcoming me. How did I get to Carville? Well, 25 years ago, I was finishing a master's degree in library and archives management. I come out of a background of fine arts and humanities, and I actually did the last year of my degree coming out to Carville one day a week, assessing their archives and telling them, what I thought they should do to prepare to open a museum. So it was love at first sight, I'm going to say. I'm a Louisiana native, but I had not ever laid eyes on Carville before. But I grew up very Catholic in a Cajun community about 100 miles away, and my mother would tell me stories about the Daughters of Charity. So I knew about Carville through Catholicism and the Daughters of Charity. So when I got the opportunity to come here, I was thrilled. LSU is only 15 miles down the road, but it's like a century away in time, because when you step here, it's a whole different vibe, a whole different culture, even though, because we had patients and sisters and other employees from all over the country and the world. So that's how I got here 25 years ago. And I loved this place immediately and was intrigued. And actually, I got lots of love back from the patients and staff. There were still about 150 patients on site then. So they said, keep in touch. We want to open a museum. We don't have the funding squared away. But when we do, if you're interested, maybe you would like to be the curator and archivist. And I said, yes, yes, and yes. And it came to pass. That's the quick version. But I'm here, and I'm thrilled to be here. So the Daughters of Charity were central for so many reasons, but they were the key volunteers who kept the volunteer-run museum going for 2 years after their centennial recognition of 1896 to 1996. They had a centennial recognition of the sisters' work here. So a lot of artifacts and archives came together at that point. And after the months-long celebration, the sisters and some of the key staff here went to the director and said, hey, what are we going to do with all these artifacts and materials, documents? And the director said, well, not sure. Maybe we should throw them away. And you can imagine everyone's fur went up, and I think light bulbs started popping. And they said, no. We're going to establish a museum. So kudos to the sisters and the patients and the other staff volunteers who kept the materials. And then I walked through the door and they said, hey, how can we save these things? Are they worth saving? And so it was really an organic, we organically worked from volunteerism into a professional museum. And I was the lucky person who was in the right place at the right time with the right skills. And in 2001, I wrote a series of management reports on how to establish a museum, what were our standards that we were aiming for, what was the industry standard. And I set everything up on paper. And then they said, okay, are you ready to go? And I said, yeah. And so I've been here ever since. Yeah.
Wow, that is such a great story. I hadn't really heard about the beginnings, how the museum itself even came to be. And I appreciate so much that you had a history with the Daughters of Charity, at least somewhat before, which is, I know, really helpful to this story for sure. So I'd like to bring Scott into our conversation now. And I know he is so excited about this. Scott's a good friend of the podcast. So yeah, join in, Scott.
Sure. So my story on this is a little bit different. Elizabeth, where you walked in to the room full of stuff and saving it from the dumpster, I walked in to this position about 5.5 years ago now. And among the collections under my care is this collection called Carville, Louisiana National Hansen's Disease Center, I think is the official name of the collection. Usually that one just gets shortened to Carville because it's the only collection that we have from the city of Carville. And so as I'm going and becoming acquainted with all of these collections and all of the different materials, I come to this one, and it's 57 boxes or so, which is substantial. And I just start taking a glance at it. I knew that we had a researcher who was working on a book on this material, so she was scheduling trips in. The book has since been published. The author is Pam Fessler, who writes for National Public Radio. And so it was one of those, okay, I knew every researcher. I have to start to learn the collections. And so I go and I take up, look at some of the stuff in Carville. And this is a story that I had never heard before. I'm not from Louisiana. I'm not even from Maryland originally. And this is one of those collections that I'm just absolutely floored and blown away by in terms of its thoroughness, what is here, full day-to-day descriptions of what is happening. The Annals of Carville that describe the day-to-day journals. And they last, I'm looking at the finding aid, so this isn't all from memory, but they last from 1934 to 1987. Different iterations of patient rules and rules for medical care. For this, I'm going to use the slenderest common name, leprosy. This disease that we think of as being non-existent anymore, this thing that sounds so old-timey as to be biblical, because it was. And here it is up into the modern day. This feels like this big anachronism to the modern world. And then we have this situation, and this is going into sort of Pam Fessler's analysis of it, that gets talked about a lot, of this situation of outcasts, of prisoners who were convicted of no crime. That's wild. That's a wild thing to behold. And then you get to the correspondence that's in the collection that goes the whole way back to 1896. You get to the extensive photographs that are in the collection that range from, daughters nursing patients to, in big landscapes of the grounds and of early dilapidated buildings and more modern looking buildings. And just the photos of the patients themselves crafting this society in spite of and because of their outcast status because of this disease. This is just a collection that blew me away. I've said that if we do the social media and, photo a week, I've said I could do 52 weeks of photos just on Carville. Not even a question. That would be the easiest thing in the world for me. And then when Wendy, you approached us with this idea of a podcast, me and a friend of mine had this idea to do a podcast maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I am so excited to have this finally happen. So I am deeply, deeply excited to be here, and hopefully audience Might get a little into some archival inside baseball, so hopefully that doesn't take away from this for you. But there you go, and that's my story of how I encountered Carville. I haven't been down there yet. I'd love to come down, Elizabeth.
As you're preserving the documents and preserving the artifacts and preserving all the information, and for you, Wendy, having done this research, the personal stories are what seem to come out. Certainly, Wendy has this connection that is very, very personal. But I'm just wondering if Wendy, you want to start a little bit just to refresh for us just your own passion for this, and maybe then we could pull in Elizabeth and Scott to talk about what's a piece that you had kind of an aha moment, or a moment when you thought this is the story, this is the part that has captured your heart, even though the whole story certainly does. What captures your heart to say this is an important thing that the world needs to know about? So Wendy, do you want to get us started?
Yes, certainly. So, Scott, I think what you said earlier about Carville being a society that was created by the patients is so well said and so on point. I am a Brooklyn native, Brooklyn, New York, which is worlds away from rural Louisiana and Carville. And yet, having been raised by someone who was a patient at Carville for so many years, during such formative years that made him into the man that he is and the father that he is, I feel very much like I come from the culture of Carville. There is a big piece of me that wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be who I am were it not for my family's history at Carville. So that is the personal piece. But I also happen to be trained as a sociologist. I never intended to write about Carville because up until I started work on the book in 2015, 2016, it was a family secret. And although we spoke about Carville and my dad's illness and recovery very openly within our home, it was not to be spoken of outside of it, even among other family members. Rather amazingly, I discovered upon publishing this book that some of my own aunts and uncles, my dad's own siblings, didn't know that he was at Carville. My grandparents had told them that he was in the deep South for 9 years for his asthma. Now, I don't know how anyone could believe that, but I suppose that's why they have that phrase, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. I think the power of the power of suggestion can be quite strong in that case. But that also shows the level of stigma around the disease that has existed throughout history, really, and that persists today. So that's one of the reasons why I think this story is so important, but also the achievement of the people, not only the patients at Carville, but also the people who were a part of the community, chiefly the Daughters of Charity, who were very much a part of the Carville family. I think of it as a family. And that's what it feels like to me. I'm a member of that family, so I can speak from that place. But also as a sociologist with my sociologist hat on, I see that in terms of kinship. One of the chief questions in the book that I ask the reader to interrogate is, what is kinship? What is family? We have these different levels of found family, and that kinship is more than genetics. Kinship is more than biology. It's who participates in creating who you are as a person, spiritually, morally, intellectually. That was my passion behind writing this book. That was one of the chief questions I wanted to ask. And I think Scott and Elizabeth are the custodians of that entire history that has made so many people. And that includes the sisters, two of whom are big figures in my book. There's Sister Laura, who was the sister who greeted my dad and all the other patients when they arrived. and kind of shepherded them through the process of becoming inducted into this world of Carville. And Sister Helen in my book, who is the pseudonym for Sister Hilary Ross, who was a researcher, a nurse. She was a photographer, and she was instrumental in the discovery of the cure, the miracle of Carville, in 1941. And I also want to point out that something else that Scott said that was really important is that this quarantine, the federal legislation that maintained the incarceration of these patients for no crime whatsoever, even though we have known since 1941 that the disease is curable, and also that it's really not very communicable at all. 95% of the population is naturally immune, and of the 5% who are susceptible, it requires prolonged exposure in order to become infected. In spite of that, there was this federal incarceration until the 1960s. So it was not at all scientific. It was political. So I really appreciate you raising that point, Scott.
I'll also add to that the photo of Sister Hilary behind the microscope is one of our single most requested photographs.
We're always talking about that incarceration, as Wendy and Scott had talked about, that this was a place that was holding people prisoner for no crime. And then my heart breaks for that. At the same time, it fills with, a sense of humility that our sisters, in the face of all of that, knowing where they were and what was happening, did their best to create a place of home. So that while, almost a cloister, that gives it more of a spiritual feel, maybe in some ways, that they brought in the compassion of Christ, that each of us as daughters of charity talk about, that we are there to be the hands and the eyes and the heart of Jesus. That's a piece of this, there's no way to get away from that. And the sisters bring that. That for me is the passion that moves me forward. So long way into getting to your answer. Where's the passion still that doesn't wane, that keeps you going?
Okay, good question. And there's a simple answer, and of course, the complicated version. So I meet descendants, like great grandchildren at this point, who are just finding out that they had a very close relative who ended up spending time at Carville. So a lot of the way that I handle the archives and even exhibits, because I'm here and I have a part-time employee, so I try to make things accessible and useful, as well as attractive and beautiful and honest. But part of the keeping it accessible is so that I can help these family members find out information as quickly as possible. And I learn things from them, and then they learn things from the collection. And sometimes I'm lucky and I can put together people who knew each other. And I know that from the stories the sisters and the patients told me, as well as reading through the archives. So it's like literally being at the center of a community who may have been dispersed, but then I'm at the center, so I get to see the pieces as they come back together and try to put them in touch with each other with their preference in mind. I'd say 99% of the people want to meet fellow kindred Carvillians, but there's a chance maybe not. So I try to develop the exhibits, the collections, the finding aids, and just my memory bank with that in mind, that they're pieces. It's so three-dimensional. You can't know it all at once. But there is that, I think, is the most exciting thing, to put people together who were part of the story or knew someone who was part of their story together, and see them exchange information and meet in real life.
I think it's fair to say, don't you think, that we have a Carville diaspora?
Yes. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Patients don't have to stay here any longer for treatment.
Yes, I think what was remarkable about Carville was that it was really a microcosm of the United States, because you had people from all over the country and all walks of life, all races, all ethnicities, all religious affiliations, political ideologies, ages, you name it. There was complete diversity because having the disease was the great leveler. You had people at Carville who were illiterate, and you had people who had been socialites formerly. As far as my dad was concerned, he was a young Chinese American kid, an immigrant who was living at the back of my grandfather's laundry in the Bronx in New York City in semi-poverty conditions. My grandfather had served in World War II in the US Army. And so, he was able to bring his sons over, but my grandmother had been left behind in China. So my dad had already been through quite a lot. He had been through the Japanese occupation. He had been through a difficult journey. He had been through a difficult reintegration into another culture without his mother. So he had been already motherless for quite a few years when he got to Carville as a teenager. And I think one of the things that he found at Carville was family, an extended family. And also, I think that the sisters were instrumental in mothering him, frankly. That was one aspect. But also coming from that kind of semi-poverty condition, my dad, the way he talks about his time at Carville was that he was afforded um, an education, both an academic education, but also an education in music, which he received initially as a form of rehabilitation for his hands. So he had piano lessons and eventually composition and voice lessons as well. He was afforded that kind of musical education that he would have never been able to access had he stayed in the Bronx. He would have never dreamed of asking for music lessons, and to have piano lessons, you have to have a piano or access to a piano that's very expensive. And yet he discovered, like my character Victor, he discovered that he had a gift, that he had a talent for music. And that was something that the sisters and the church and the community at Carville nurtured.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this part of the conversation because as you both are speaking about the descendants of the patients who were at Carville, and you, Wendy, as a child of someone who was there, I'm feeling the sense that I think many sisters feel is we don't have children who carry on our story in the same way, and so as a younger, newer member in the community, I realize those stories are then held by us, and it behooves us to tell those stories. And so when I first started looking at this in relation to having conversations with you, I realized there were over 130 Daughters of Charity involved in the work of Carville from its very beginning. And I think there are only 5 still living. And that is really like a point of crisis of storytelling, because they were adult women at the time when many of the residents that are still living, your dad, were children, and so, or were young adults even, and so many of them have gone to God with these stories. And Scott, you hold the records. I'm out here living my life and hearing their stories, but the story of the Daughters of Charity really is held in these documents, because we don't have the progeny in the same way, except through people like your dad and others who can tell the story. And so it would be a really interesting project to start getting those stories from them about the sisters, because not that we want to be talked about, I think that's part of our humility gets in our way sometimes, right? We're always saying, no, don't talk about us. It's all about you. And it is. But they hold the story in a way that we don't as sisters. I can see their names, but I've never met any of them. Many of them died, I'm sure, never talking about, other than the recorded annals that Scott has in hand. How do you find this information in its ability to help us learn who the sisters were, not just what they did, but who are they as women?
In terms of the sisters, I can always say that the accounts that I do see always speak very glowingly of the sisters. They were never perceived as jailers or as the ones responsible for the situation that the patients were in. Not at any point have I ever seen anything like that.
I have to say that they were amazing managers, which will surprise no one. And they were not pushovers. And I think they may have tweaked the noses of a couple of the Board of Control members along the way, as well as some of the people on the state side of the government and the federal government. To my approval, I might add. I was laughing with kind of like understanding, reading through the letters and reading the frustration, which was usually between the lines, but not always. And, well, they were all women, obviously, and all of the Board of Control were men. And so that you had a little bit of this going on. And they were not Southern women, so culturally they were a little different than the Board of Control, who were, I think, for the most part, Louisiana born and raised individuals, male individuals. So there was a cultural clash. The sisters were used to being in charge in their space, and they were no nonsense, all nurses, I think primarily, and then branched out to other things and got trained and retrained as time went on. But they were used to speaking their mind, being direct, and managing well. So all of that I related to. And I think when you sit and read the letters one by one and get the responses back and forth, and then double check it against the date books and the annals they left behind, you get a real clear picture of some of those sisters, strength of personality and perseverance.
Absolutely. I got a very, very clear sense in my dad's notes from the infirmary, which were kept meticulously by the sisters who took care of him. I got a real clear sense of their personalities, and many of which were delightful, frankly. And I learned a lot about the continuity of my dad's personality too, because he was just a kid when he first entered. In his first couple of years at Carville, he was in and out of the infirmary because he was very ill and needed extensive treatment, surgery, etc. And he had a lot of regressions or relapses. So he was in the infirmary quite a lot. The sisters' notes were in some cases hilarious because, they knew my dad. My dad, and Elizabeth knows him. He is a bit of a staunch character, shall we say, oppositional, recalcitrant, and he's always been that way, I guess. When he was a teenager, he would go through stints where he would purposely not speak to the doctors. He wouldn't respond to them. He would, go seemingly catatonic, except the nurses knew that he was doing it just to get at them. And that's in their notes, which I think is so fun. I just love the fact that they understood him and understood that he was a kid who felt abandoned and traumatized and scared, but at the same time, they respected that he was this young man who had a sense of fun and a sense of humor and a sense of mischief. My dad is very mischievous as a person. So I loved being able to see that and glean their different personalities. Some of them were a little bit more strict, and some of them were a little bit more amused by him. So I really got a sense of that, that living history, I suppose. And I'm so happy that we're going to be able to keep some of that history on the record in subsequent episodes with the nurses, with the sisters who were nurses on staff. That's so important to me. Another thing that I found in the archives when I went to visit Elizabeth for the first time with my dad in 2016 were the oral histories. That is amazing that Elizabeth has those. I was looking specifically for oral histories of people who were young, of people who were teenagers when they were at Carville, because I knew that I was writing about that era of the 1950s and a group of teens who were there together. So I found a treasure trove in terms of that. I got a sense not just of how kids talked at that time, but also about how kids navigated Carville at that time, because that was a very different experience for teens than it was for adults, I'm sure. So that was very unique. And I know that my dad gave something like a 3-hour long oral history for you to transcribe, Elizabeth. So, he's a real chatty guy. But among those oral histories, I was, of course, looking for firsthand accounts by Asian American patients. There was a 15% Asian population in the 1950s at Carville, which is a huge number if you compare it to the number of Asian Americans in the country at large. And yet I did not find a single one. So that blew my mind. I was shocked to discover that. And it made me feel even more compelled to fill that record with my dad's account.
Yes, thanks for bringing the oral histories up, Wendy. I'm very proud of that collection. There were 50 here when I arrived, and I added 50 more. And it's about half and half patients and staff. And then they were all transcribed. So that makes it very, very useful for a researcher like Wendy and everyone else who comes, after that. And some folks weren't represented because they didn't start taking oral histories until the 1990s. The daughters were very generous with us. I have copies of all of the original letters from Carville's sisters. I made copies about 10 years ago.
As you talk about the material that you have, the letters written, what the daughters wrote about, we're celebrating this year the 400th anniversary of a document that St. Louise de Marillac, who is our foundress, along with St. Vincent de Paul, in 1623, she had a profound religious experience where the Lord had really given her direction, and that was to be part of a community of women who would have many comings and goings. They would be out about in the community. 1623, all women were cloistered. And so here is this woman, married, has a child, and is thinking, I have designs. God has designs on me. And God lifted doubts, and she wrote it down, and she carried it in her pocket, and in the 1600s, to the day she died. When she died, that little piece of paper, which is like parchment, was taken and preserved. So 400 years later, we still have that document. And I think, St. Vincent de Paul and St. Louise de Marillac set us up to have an incredible respect for the written word and storytelling. Vincent de Paul has a 10-volume collection of his letters. They wrote no books. They wrote no theology books. They wrote only letters and conferences to the sisters and the congregation of the mission priests at the time. And I tell that part of the story because it doesn't surprise me that the sisters would have these very honest and very telling letters, because that is part of our tradition. We have 600 or so letters of St. Louise de Marillac, and it blows my mind. And so that's the other part for me as a daughter of charity, who says that history of us preserving the preciousness of the story of the people we serve, not just the story of us or why we do. What gets discovered in what we do is why we do it. It's because we see Christ in the other. It's because that's where our service as women who live out in the world. The other part of this story that fascinates me is that when the community was about to take on this work, this ministry for us, they thought maybe 10 sisters would sign up because it was kind of a dangerous thing, and 100 volunteered. As you said in the beginning, Elizabeth, so a volunteer group, these sisters are volunteering to do something that others wouldn't come near. And again, that's the other part for me.
Sorry. The sisters told me that this was the only assignment that they could reject. And they also told me no sister assigned ever rejected it.
Scott and Elizabeth, I'd love to hear your thoughts on why people have only just begun to see the value and the preciousness, as Sister Elizabeth said, of these stories and also of the artifacts that come from Carville. I mean, as a family member, a Carville family member, I know that we have plenty of Carville artifacts in my parents' house. You know, I grew up surrounded by them, including my dad's music that all came from Carville with the notes of his music teacher on them. So I'm curious to know, Elizabeth and Scott, how we can perhaps reframe that thinking to understand that this story has great value on a national, historical, and cultural level and needs to be preserved and needs to be taken seriously in that sense.
I think when things were naturally winding up here, when they realized we don't need a quarantine hospital site, no one's going to live here anymore. Hansen's disease became an outpatient diagnosis in the 70s and definitely by 1980. Definitely. Every new case is an outpatient case. But they also had aging former patients to care for. So it was it was a tight rope, and they had to ask patients, they queried the patients themselves, how do we tie this story up at Carville? And that's another podcast. You know, I can tell you all about that, the ins and outs of that. But they tried to care for those that were here when things weren't so great and they were aging and maybe had forgone having families or been rejected by families. So it was a tight rope of sorts, but I think they did the right thing, and patients were given a choice, and many stayed here for 20 years after the hospital relocated. But I think they have recognized that it's important because I'm here and we're doing a renovation. We've only been a museum for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to, get things in order to pass it on to the next generation of curators, of archivists.
Mm. I think perhaps one of the psychological obstacles from the perspective of former patients and family members of former patients is that there was so much secrecy around it. I think it's hard to kind of switch gears and to see it as something that shouldn't carry any stigma and that no longer does carry stigma. So when my dad had his, I guess, for lack of a better term, exit interview when he was being discharged from the hospital. And I think this is probably true for most other patients who had homes to go back to. He was told quite explicitly by the counselor to leave it all behind, right, and to not talk about Carville and not talk about the fact that he had had Hansen's, if he wanted to re-enter society, if he wanted to have a regular job, if he wanted to get married, if he wanted to move on with his life, he was told that he had to leave Carville behind, this really big piece of himself and his history. So I think he took that quite seriously, and I wouldn't be surprised if many other patients had that same mindset when they were discharged. So I feel like our goal here, all of us, is to try and shift that mindset, to try and remove some of that obstacle.
Well, even the fact that this was, I'm not going to say a utopia free of racism, but this was this integrated community that existed in the Deep South for a long, long while through the Jim Crow era. And yet we see that this medical diagnosis did cut across those things.
Yeah.
And I think as, our understandings of race and class and disability change, and we realize how important those are to our country and just how all of us are shaped as individuals, I think that's another way to understand this that can kind of catch people's interest, that this was this strange place where Jim Crow didn't reign fully supreme.
I just appreciate so much all of what we've talked about today, and excited that this is going to lead us to our next episode, which will be with as many sisters as we can find and get together So managing 4 people on a podcast is going to be interesting when there could be up to 6 or 7 of us together. Wendy and I will join together with, as I said, I think there are at least 5 that we've been able to find who had at least a year's experience at Carville since the 1960s. So it'll be great to move this conversation into exactly what we've been saying, is hearing the story of this piece of the story that's been rather silent in some ways. We've had people talk about us, but maybe it's time to talk for ourselves in a more public way through the podcast. So I want to thank all of you for your time today. And I know this is not a conversation that ends here by any means. And this podcast airwave is always open to have more of these conversations. And I hope that Elizabeth and Scott and Wendy, you can all meet one day in Emmitsburg. That would be great. It's such a beautiful, beautiful place. And if you do, Scott, make sure that I need to be there, and just send that message out to those who need to hear it, that I need to be there, because I would love to welcome you into that space and to welcome you to the archives along with Scott to continue this investigation. So thank you all so much for your time and for this conversation. And we hope that we'll see you in the next one, Wendy, as we move on in this series to then talk to the sisters themselves who were there in the most recent past.
Thank you so much, Sister Elizabeth. I'm super excited too. I love that we're carrying on the torch of the mission of the Star magazine, which was the patient-run magazine at Carville, which was to shine a light on the truth of Hansen's and to humanize its sufferers. So I feel like we are continuing to honor that tradition and that mission. So thank you, Sister Elizabeth and Scott, for being a part of that.
Oh, thank you for including me. This was so much fun.
And just as one little, for those looking to start their research, but don't necessarily know who to reach out to or who to call quite yet, the Star newspaper, the patient-run newspaper, the entire run is available through Louisiana Digital Library. And Elizabeth, I'm stealing your thunder because you clearly had a hand in that.
I did. That was a wonderful project. It brings me many outside researchers who couldn't do remote research, and puts us in touch, and then we can continue here on the ground in Carville. So yes.
That's great. And we'll put links to all of the relevant information, if there are any that you have that you want to make sure that we have connected to this episode, so others can just click on and get to where they need to go in their own research. That would be great. So again, thank you all so much. And I'm sure this is not the last conversation.
You're welcome.